The alarm shrieked at 6:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 months. I slammed my hand down on the snooze button, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety already forming in my stomach. Today was the day. After endless postponements and legal maneuvering, my case was finally going to court. I stared at the ceiling, watching the early morning light filter through my bedroom curtains, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. I dragged myself out of bed and shuffled to the bathroom, catching my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles had taken permanent residence under my eyes, and my usually vibrant brown hair hung limp around my shoulders. 3 months of legal hell had aged me years. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would wash away some of the exhaustion that seemed to have seeped into my bones. The shower felt like a ritual cleansing, the hot water cascading over my shoulders as I tried to mentally prepare for what lay ahead. I had rehearsed my testimony countless times, but the words still felt foreign on my tongue. How do you explain to a courtroom full of strangers that your entire life had been turned upside down by someone you trusted completely? Getting dressed felt like putting on armor. I had chosen my outfit carefully the night before, a navy blue suit that my sister said made me look professional and trustworthy. The fabric felt stiff against my skin, unfamiliar and constraining. I wasn't used to wearing business attire. My usual uniform was scrubs and comfortable shoes from my job at the pediatric clinic. But today, I needed to look like someone a jury would believe. I stood in front of my closet mirror, adjusting the collar of my blazer for the 10th time. My hands were already trembling slightly, and I clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. I had to be strong today. Too much depended on it. The children I worked with, their families, and most importantly, justice for what had been done. To them, downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but my stomach churned at the thought of eating anything. My roommate Sarah had left a note on the counter. "You've got this, Em. Call me as soon as it's over. Love you." I smiled despite my nerves. Sarah had been my rock through all of this, listening to me practice my testimony and holding me while I cried about the uncertainty of it all. I forced myself to eat a piece of toast, knowing I'd need the energy for the long day ahead. Each bite felt like swallowing sand, but I choked it down anyway. The coffee was too bitter, but the caffeine was necessary. I had barely slept in weeks, and today I needed to be sharp, articulate, and convincing. My phone buzzed with messages from family and friends wishing me luck. My mother had sent 3 texts already, each more anxious than the last. "Are you eating breakfast? Don't forget to speak clearly. We're all praying for you, sweetheart." I typed back quick responses, not wanting to get drawn into lengthy conversations that would only increase my anxiety. The morning news droned in the background as I gathered my things. I tried not to listen too closely, but fragments of stories about courtroom dramas and legal victories drifted through. I wondered if my case would make the news if things went well today, or if they went badly. The thought made my chest tighten. With fresh worry, I checked my purse for the 3rd time, making sure I had everything I needed. My driver's license, the subpoena, tissues, mints, and a small photo of the children from the clinic. They were my motivation, my reminder of why this case mattered so much. Their innocent faces smiled up at me from the photo, trusting and pure. They deserved justice. The clock on my kitchen wall ticked loudly in the sudden silence. 8:15 a.m. I needed to leave soon to meet my lawyer at his office before heading to the courthouse. My hands were sweating, and I wiped them on my skirt, hoping the fabric wouldn't wrinkle too badly. I walked through my small apartment one more time, straightening things that didn't need straightening. A nervous habit I'd developed over the past few months. Everything looked so normal, so ordinary. It was hard to believe that by tonight, everything could be different. My life, my career, my future, it all hung in the balance of what would happen in that courtroom today. The bathroom mirror reflected back a woman I barely recognized. The confident pediatric nurse who used to comfort frightened children and reassure worried parents seemed to have disappeared, replaced by this anxious, hollow-eyed version of herself. I applied lipstick with shaking hands, trying to add some color to my pale complexion. My car keys felt heavy in my hand as I picked them up from the kitchen counter. This was it. There was no turning back now. The past 3 months of depositions, meetings, and sleepless nights had all led to this moment. I thought about the phone call that had started it all, the horrible accusations, the investigation that had torn through the clinic like a hurricane. I paused at my front door, my hand on the knob. Once I walked through that door, once I drove to that courthouse, there would be no more hiding, no more pretending this wasn't happening. I would have to face him in court, look him in the eye, and tell the world what he had done. The morning air was crisp against my face as I stepped outside. My neighbors were going about their normal routines, walking dogs, loading kids into cars for school, heading off to jobs that didn't involve testifying in criminal court. I envied their ordinary Tuesday morning, their simple concerns and Straightforward days. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I had to consciously slow it down. Panic attacks were a luxury I couldn't afford today. I needed every ounce of composure I could muster. The radio came on automatically when I started the car, playing some upbeat pop song that felt completely inappropriate for the gravity of the day. I turned it off, preferring the silence to the jarring cheerfulness of the music. The quiet felt heavy, filled with all the words I would soon have to speak in that courtroom. As I backed out of my driveway, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked determined despite the fear swimming in them. I had made it this far. I had survived the initial shock, the investigation, the character assassination attempts. I could survive today too. I had to. The drive to my lawyer's office would take 20 minutes in normal traffic, 20 minutes to steel myself for the battle ahead, 20 minutes to remember why I was doing this, why I couldn't just let it go and move on with my life, because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight might destroy you in the process. My lawyer's office building looked imposing in the morning light, all glass and steel reaching toward a gray October sky. I parked in the visitor's lot, my hands still trembling slightly as I turned off the engine. Through the large windows, I could see people in suits moving purposefully through the lobby, their briefcases in confident strides making them look like they belonged in this world of legal battles and courtroom dramas. I felt like an imposter in my carefully chosen navy suit. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt endless, each floor number lighting up like a countdown to my fate. My stomach churned with each ding of the elevator, and I pressed my hand against my abdomen, trying to calm the nervous flutter that had taken up permanent residence there. The other passengers avoided eye contact, lost in their own important business, their own legal crises that had brought them here so early in the morning. James Morrison's law office occupied half of the 15th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, greeted me with a sympathetic smile that immediately put me on edge. I had learned to recognize that particular expression over the past 3 months, the look people gave victims full of pity and careful kindness. That made me feel like something broken that needed handling with care. "He's waiting for you in his office, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice soft and maternal. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor as I walked down the hallway, past framed diplomas and awards that spoke to James's impressive legal career. I wondered if my case would become another victory he could hang on his wall, or if it would join the inevitable losses that every lawyer preferred not to discuss. James looked up from his desk as I knocked on his open door. At 53, he had the kind of distinguished appearance that juries trusted: silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. He had been recommended by a friend of my sister's, someone who had used him in a divorce case and praised his dedication to his clients. I prayed that dedication would be enough to get me through today. "Emily, good morning," he said, standing to greet me. His handshake was firm, professional, but I noticed he held my hand a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to transfer some of his confidence to me through touch. "How are you feeling? Did you manage to get any sleep last night?" I forced a smile that felt like a grimace. "A few hours. I kept going over my testimony, making sure I have all the details straight." The lie came easily. I had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible way today could go wrong, every question the defense attorney might ask that could trip me up or make me look unreliable. James gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, and I sat down carefully, smoothing my skirt and crossing my ankles the way my mother had taught me years ago. Good posture, professional appearance, composed demeanor, all the armor I could put on to hide the terrified woman underneath. "I want to go over a few key points before we head to the courthouse," James said, pulling out a thick file folder. My name was typed on the tab in neat block letters. Davidson, EMILY, criminal case 202-4CR-8847. Seeing my life reduced to a file number made something cold settle in my chest. We spent the next hour reviewing my testimony, James asking the questions he expected the prosecutor to ask, then playing devil's advocate with the kinds of challenges the defense would likely throw at me. Each hypothetical question felt like a small wound, forcing me to relive details I had tried so hard to suppress, to examine my own actions and decisions under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. "Remember," James said, leaning forward in his chair, "stick to the facts. Don't let them bait you into emotional responses. The defense will try to make you angry, confused, or upset. Their job is to create reasonable doubt, and if they can make you appear unstable or unreliable, they'll do it." His words were meant to prepare me, but they only added another layer to my growing anxiety. At 9:30 a.m., James closed the file and stood up. "It's time," he said simply. Those two words carried the weight of months of preparation, of sleepless nights and difficult conversations, of a life that had been put on hold while the legal system slowly ground forward. I stood as well, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The courthouse was a 30-minute drive from James's office, and he had arranged for us to go together in his car. I was grateful not to have to navigate downtown traffic. While my nerves were already frayed, his BMW was immaculate, smelling of leather cleaner and subtle cologne. Classical music played softly from the speakers, something soothing that I couldn't identify but appreciated nonetheless. "The media attention has been minimal," James said as we drove through the city streets. "This isn't a high-profile case, which works in our favor. Less circus atmosphere, more focus on the actual testimony and evidence." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if the lack of media attention was comforting or somehow made the whole thing feel less important than it was. That we approached downtown. The buildings grew taller and more imposing. The courthouse came into view, a massive stone structure that looked like it had been designed to intimidate anyone who dared to seek justice within its walls. Gothic arches and stern-faced gargoyles stared down at the street below, and I found myself wondering how many other scared witnesses had walked through those doors, carrying their truths and their fears in equal measure. James found a parking spot in the lot, reserved for attorneys and court officers. As I got out of the car, I noticed other people walking toward the courthouse entrance, some in business suits like mine, others in more casual clothes, a few who looked like they might be reporters despite what James had said about minimal media attention. Everyone seemed to move with purpose except me. I felt like I was floating, disconnected from my body and the reality of what was about to happen. The security checkpoint inside the courthouse felt like entering an airport, complete with metal detectors and stern-faced guards who looked like they had seen every kind of human drama imaginable. I placed my purse on the conveyor belt and walked through the detector, hoping my nervous energy wouldn't somehow set off alarms. The lobby was a massive space with marble floors and high ceilings. That made every sound echo. Lawyers in expensive suits talked in hushed tones with their clients. Police officers in uniform moved through with files under their arms, and family members sat on benches, looking worried and out of place. The smell of floor cleaner and nervous sweat hung in the air like a fog. James led me to the elevator that would take us to the third floor, where our courtroom was located. As the doors closed, trapping us in the small space with two other passengers, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at me appeared composed, professional, ready for whatever came next. It was a convincing facade, and I hoped it would hold up under the pressure of cross-examination. "Courtroom 3B, James said as we exited the elevator. The hallway stretched out before us, lined with identical wooden doors that led to individual courtrooms, where people's fates were decided every day. The fluorescent lighting was harsh and unflattering, casting everything in a slightly greenish tint that made everyone look slightly ill. We passed a few other people in the hallway. A young man in handcuffs flanked by two officers, an elderly woman crying softly into a tissue, a group of what looked like law students taking notes and whispering to each other. This was their classroom, but for me, it was the place where my future would be decided. James stopped outside courtroom 3B and turned to me. "Are you ready?" he asked, his hand on the door handle. The question seemed absurd. How could anyone be ready for something like this? But I nodded anyway, because ready or not, it was time to face what I had been running toward and running from for the past 3 months. The heavy wooden door opened with a soft creak, and I took my first step into the courtroom where I would either find justice or watch it slip away forever. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. Nothing like the grand chambers I had seen in movies and television shows. The walls were paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving the entire space a somber, almost oppressive atmosphere. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that same harsh institutional glow. I had noticed in the hallway, the air smelled of old wood, leather, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps the accumulated weight of 1,000 human dramas that had played out within these walls. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided. From behind an imposing mahogany bench that elevated her several feet above the rest of the courtroom, she was a woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses that she wore on a thin chain around her neck. Her black robes made her appear both authoritative and mysterious, like some ancient oracle. Who would divine truth from the testimony about to be presented? I had researched her background extensively, 23 years on the bench. A reputation for fairness, but also for running a tight courtroom where nonsense wasn't tolerated. The jury box sat to my left, 12 empty chairs that would soon hold the people who would decide my fate. The thought made my stomach lurch. 12 strangers who knew nothing about me, nothing about the children I worked with, nothing about the man who had shattered so many lives with his actions. They would listen to testimony, examine evidence, and somehow determine where the truth lay. In this maze of accusations and denials, James guided me to a seat in the front row, directly behind where we would sit once proceedings began. The wooden benches were as uncomfortable as they looked, with thin cushions that had been worn down by countless anxious family members, victims, and spectators over the years. I smoothed my skirt and tried to find a position that didn't make me feel like I was perched on the edge of a precipice. The prosecution table sat directly in front of us, a heavy wooden desk covered with stacks of files, legal pads, and evidence folders. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen was already there, organizing her materials with the methodical precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. She was younger than I had expected, probably early 30s, with long black hair and a crisp white shirt under her navy blazer. When she turned to acknowledge James with a nod, I noticed her expression was focused but kind, the look of someone who genuinely believed in the case she was about to present. Across the aisle, the defense table remained empty, though I could see files and briefcases already positioned there. My chest tightened at the thought of seeing him again. Dr. Marcus Webb, the pediatric psychiatrist who had been my colleague, my mentor, and ultimately my betrayer. The man whose actions had brought us all to this sterile courtroom where his freedom would be weighed against the testimony of his victims. The court reporter sat at a small desk positioned between the judge's bench and the witness stand, her fingers poised over a stenotype machine that would capture every word spoken in this room. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who gave me a brief encouraging smile when she noticed me looking in her direction. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline. Other people began filtering into the courtroom as the morning progressed. I recognized some faces. Detective Rodriguez, who had handled the initial investigation, looking official and competent in his dark suit. Several parents from the clinic sat in the rows behind me, their faces tense with the same mixture of hope and dread that I felt churning in my own chest. These were people whose children had been patients of Dr. Webb's, families who had trusted him with their most precious possessions and discovered that trust had been hideously misplaced. A bailiff entered through a side door, a tall man with graying temples who carried himself with the easy authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in chaotic situations. He began arranging papers on his desk and checking his equipment, preparing for another day of human drama to unfold. In his courtroom, the normalcy of his routine was both comforting and unsettling for him. This was just another Tuesday morning at work, but for me, it was the day that would define the rest of my life. James leaned over to whisper something in my ear about the proceedings that would follow, but I found it difficult to concentrate on his words. My attention kept drifting to the witness stand, a simple wooden chair positioned to the right of the judge's bench. Soon, I would sit in that chair, raise my right hand, swear to tell the truth, and then do exactly that. No matter how much it hurt to speak those words aloud. The clock on the wall read 9:55 a.m. in 5 minutes. Court would be called to session, and there would be no more time for second thoughts or last-minute preparations. I could feel my pulse quickening, a steady drumbeat in my ears that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. My mouth felt dry and I wished I had brought a bottle of water, though I doubted I would be able to swallow anything past the tight knot of anxiety lodged in my throat. More spectators continued to arrive, filling the benches behind me with a low murmur of whispered conversations and rustling papers. Some faces were familiar, colleagues from the clinic, friends who had come to offer support, family members I had asked not to come but who had ignored my wishes and shown up anyway. Others were strangers, people whose connection to this case I could only guess at. The defense table remained conspicuously empty, and I found myself glancing at the courtroom doors, wondering when he would arrive. Would he look remorseful, defiant? Would he be able to meet my eyes when I testified? Or would he stare at his hands like the coward I believed him to be? The questions swirled in my mind, adding another layer of anxiety to the growing pile. Ada Chen turned around and gave me a reassuring nod, the kind of gesture that said she was ready for battle on my behalf. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, building the case that would hopefully put Marcus Webb behind bars where he belonged. I had grown to trust her during our preparation sessions, impressed by her thoroughness and her genuine anger at what had been done to the children in my care. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the drama to begin. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the dark wood floors. Dust motes danced in the beams, tiny particles floating in seemingly random patterns that somehow felt symbolic of the chaos that had brought us all to this place. James checked his watch and then looked back toward the doors. "He should be here any minute," he murmured, though I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. The waiting was almost unbearable, this suspended moment before everything began, when possibilities still existed and outcomes remained undetermined. In a few hours, the jury would know everything: the accusations, the evidence, the testimonies that would either vindicate my decision to come forward or destroy what remained of my carefully constructed life. I closed my eyes and tried to center myself, drawing on the meditation techniques I had learned during the worst days after the initial accusations came to light. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. It was a simple exercise, but it helped slow my racing heart and clear some of the fog from my anxious mind. A commotion near the doors made me open my eyes. The defense attorney had arrived, a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. Behind him, flanked by what looked like family members, was Dr. Marcus Webb. My breath caught in my throat as I saw him for the first time since that horrible day when everything had fallen apart. He looked older, more haggard than I remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a slight stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. But he was still the same man who had smiled at me across the clinic break room, who had offered career advice and professional guidance, who had seemed like everything a mentor should be until the mask slipped and revealed the monster underneath. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Hendricks entered the courtroom, her black robes flowing behind her as she took her place behind the bench. Hear the, he announced in a voice that had probably opened thousands of court sessions. The Superior Court of the State is now in session, the Honorable Patricia Hendricks presiding. As I stood with everyone else in the courtroom, I felt the weight of this moment settling around me like a heavy cloak. There was no turning back now. The machinery of justice was in motion, and all I could do was hold on tight and hope that truth would be enough to see me through whatever came next. Judge Hendricks settled into her chair and surveyed the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every possible variation of human drama unfold before her bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the file in front of her. The rustle of papers unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. "Good morning, everyone. We are here today in the matter of the state versus Dr. Marcus Webb. Case number 2024 CR8 847. Her voice carried the authority of decades on the bench, but there was something else in her tone that I couldn't quite identify. A tension that seemed at odds with the routine nature of her words. She glanced around the courtroom more than once, her eyes lingering on the spectator section longer than seemed necessary. When her gaze swept over the defense table, I noticed the slightest tightening around her eyes, as if she was seeing something that concerned her. Ada Chen rose to present her opening statement, her voice clear and confident as she outlined the case against Dr. Webb. But as she spoke, I found myself distracted by small details that seemed wrong somehow. The court reporter kept glancing toward the back of the courtroom, her usually steady typing interrupted by brief pauses that coincided with sounds I couldn't identify. Footsteps in the hallway that seemed heavier than normal. Voices that carried an urgency that didn't match the typical courthouse bustle. James sat beside me, outwardly composed but exhibiting subtle signs of agitation that only became apparent when I really looked at him. His left hand drummed silently against his thigh, a nervous habit I had never seen before in our months of working together. Every few minutes he would turn slightly in his seat, ostensibly to check the time on the wall clock behind us, but his eyes always swept the room as he did so, cataloging faces and positions with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific. Dr. Webb himself seemed different from the confident, charismatic man I had known at the clinic. He sat rigidly upright at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly in front of him that his knuckles had turned white. What disturbed me most was that he wasn't looking at Ada Chen as she spoke, or at the judge, or even at his own attorney. Instead, his eyes kept darting to the courtroom doors and the windows, as if he was expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. The bailiff had positioned himself differently than I had observed during my previous court visits. For depositions, instead of his usual relaxed stance near the judge's bench, he stood closer to the spectator section, one hand resting casually on his radio. His eyes swept the room constantly, never settling on any one person or area for more than a few seconds. It was the stance of someone anticipating trouble, though I couldn't imagine what kind of disruption he might be expecting in a criminal trial. Detective Rodriguez, who had been scheduled to testify later in the day, was already present in the courtroom despite not being called yet. He sat 3 rows behind me, but when I turned to give him an encouraging nod, I noticed he wasn't paying attention to the proceedings at all. Instead, he was focused on his phone, reading what appeared to be text messages with increasing frequency. Each time his phone buzzed, his expression grew more tense, And once I saw him type a quick response with urgency that seemed completely unrelated to the trial taking place in front of us. Ada Chen continued her opening statement, but I noticed that she too seemed distracted. She stumbled over words she had rehearsed perfectly during our preparation sessions, and twice she glanced at her phone lying on the prosecution table. When it lit up with what appeared to be an incoming message, she actually paused mid-sentence for several seconds, before recovering her composure and continuing with her presentation. The defense attorney, Harold Morrison, no relation to James, despite the shared surname, seemed the only person in the room who appeared completely focused on the proceedings. But even his apparent calm struck me as wrong somehow. He was too relaxed, too confident for someone whose client was facing serious criminal charges. He leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone holding a winning hand, occasionally making notes but generally appearing unconcerned about the damning evidence being presented against his client. A new wave of anxiety washed over me as I realized that everyone around me seemed to be operating with information I didn't have. The undercurrents of tension in the room felt like the charged atmosphere before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to vibrate with potential energy waiting to be released. But I had no idea what was causing this collective unease or why so many people seemed to be bracing for something I couldn't see coming. James leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Do you notice anything unusual about the security today?" His question sent a chill down my spine because it confirmed that the strange atmosphere wasn't just my imagination. I looked around more carefully and realized he was right. There seemed to be more uniformed officers in the hallway than usual, and I had seen at least 2 people in suits who looked like they might be federal agents lingering near the elevators when we arrived. The jury selection process, which should have been routine, was taking much longer than expected. Potential jurors were being questioned more extensively than normal, with both attorneys asking probing questions about their backgrounds, their connections to the medical community, and their feelings about testifying in cases involving children. Several potential jurors were dismissed for reasons that seemed vague and unsatisfactory, leaving me wondering what criteria were really being used to select the people who would decide this case. Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, ostensibly to allow the attorneys to review their jury selection notes, but the way she left the bench suggested urgency rather than routine court business. She didn't retire to her chambers as usual, but instead stepped to the side of the courtroom and engaged in what appeared to be an intense, whispered conversation with the bailiff and a man I didn't recognize who had been sitting in the back row. Throughout the morning during the recess, instead of the typical relaxed chatter that usually filled courtrooms during breaks, an uncomfortable silence settled over the spectators. People spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all, and I noticed several family members looking around nervously as if they too sensed that something was amiss. The parents from the clinic who had come to support me looked confused and worried, exchanging glances that seemed to ask the same question I was thinking. What was happening here that we didn't understand? Dr. Webb's family members, who had been sitting stoically behind the defense table, appeared increasingly agitated as the morning progressed. His wife, a petite woman with graying hair whom I had met at several clinic social events, kept checking her phone and whispering urgently to the man beside her. At one point, she got up abruptly and left the courtroom, not returning until just before the recess ended. When she came back, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. Ada Chen spent the recess not reviewing her notes as I expected, but in intense conversation with Detective Rodriguez and 2 other men who had entered the courtroom during the break. They stood in a tight circle near the prosecution table, their voices too low for me to hear, but their body language suggesting they were discussing something far more serious than trial strategy. When Chen glanced in my direction, her expression was troubled in a way that made my stomach clench with fresh anxiety. The court reporter, who usually spent breaks socializing with the bailiff or organizing her equipment, sat frozen at her machine, staring at something on her phone screen with an expression of growing alarm. When she looked up and caught me watching her, she quickly put the phone away and busied herself with her stenotype machine, but not before I saw her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the paper as Judge Hendricks returned to her bench and called the court back to session. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as typical pretrial tension had evolved into something much more ominous. The air felt thick with unspoken knowledge, with secrets that everyone seemed to share except me. I found myself gripping the edge of the bench, my knuckles white with tension, as the realization dawned on me that we weren't just here for a criminal trial. Something else was happening. Something that had turned this ordinary courthouse into a powder keg of nervous energy and barely contained panic. And as Dr. Webb's attorney rose to begin his opening statement, I noticed that his previous confidence had been replaced by something that looked very much like fear. Whatever was coming, whatever had everyone so on edge, was about to reveal itself in ways that none of us were prepared for. The clock on the wall read 11:47 a.m., and I had the sudden, inexplicable feeling that I should remember that time, because everything that happened after this moment would be measured against it. The last few minutes of normalcy, the final moments before the world as I knew it ceased to exist, were ticking away with mechanical precision while I sat helplessly in the front row. Waiting for disaster to strike, Harold Morrison stood to address the jury, his expensive suit immaculate despite the beads of perspiration I could now see forming along his hairline. His opening words were standard defense attorney rhetoric: reasonable doubt, presumption of innocence, the burden of proof. But his delivery lacked the conviction I had expected from someone of his reputation. His voice carried a tremor that seemed to grow more pronounced with each sentence, and twice he paused to clear his throat in a way that suggested his mouth had gone completely dry. As Morrison spoke, I became acutely aware of sounds that hadn't been there before. Heavy footsteps in the hallway outside the courtroom doors, moving with purpose and frequency that suggested something more than routine courthouse business. The distant hum of what sounded like radio chatter, too faint to make out individual words but carrying the urgent cadence of emergency communications. Even the building's ventilation system seemed louder than it had been moments before, as if the very infrastructure was holding its breath. Judge Hendricks interrupted Morrison mid-sentence, something I had never seen happen during any of my previous court experiences. "Counselor," she said, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of tension that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Perhaps we could move to your main points more quickly." It wasn't really a suggestion, and Morrison nodded rapidly, shuffling his papers with hands that were now visibly shaking. Dr. Webb had gone completely rigid at the defense table. Where moments before he had been fidgeting and glancing around the room, he now sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with the fixed intensity of someone trying very hard not to look at something specific. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and I could see a pulse hammering in his temple even from my position several feet behind him. When his wife leaned forward to whisper something in his ear, he jerked away from her touch as if she had burned him. The bailiff's radio crackled to life, just loud enough for the front rows to hear fragments of what sounded like tactical communications. Words like perimeter and all units filtered through the static before. He quickly adjusted the volume down to almost nothing, but the damage was done. The sound had confirmed what the growing tension in the room had been suggesting. This wasn't about the trial anymore. Something else was happening, something that required tactical units and perimeters. Ada Chen was no longer even pretending to pay attention to Morrison's opening statement. She was bent over her phone, typing rapidly, her face growing paler with each message she received. At one point, she looked up and made direct eye contact with Detective Rodriguez, who had moved closer to the front of the courtroom. The look they shared was loaded with meaning. I couldn't decipher, but it made my chest tighten with dread. James grabbed my arm suddenly, his fingers pressing into my flesh with enough force to leave marks. "Emily," he whispered urgently, his breath hot against my ear. "When I say so, I want you to get down. Do you understand me? Get down and stay down until I tell you it's safe." His words hit me like a physical blow, confirming every instinct that had been screaming at me that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. The courtroom doors opened and two men in dark suits entered, moving with the controlled urgency of law enforcement professionals. They didn't take seats, but instead positioned themselves on either side of the entrance, their eyes scanning the room with systematic precision. One of them spoke quietly into a microphone attached to his sleeve, using the kind of coded language that suggested this was a coordinated operation involving multiple agencies. Morrison had stopped speaking altogether now, his opening statement abandoned mid-sentence as he stared at something behind me. I turned to follow his gaze and saw that the spectator section had been quietly evacuating, while everyone's attention was focused on the front of the courtroom. The parents from the clinic, the family members, even some of the court personnel, they were all gone, leaving behind only empty benches and an atmosphere so charged with tension it felt like the air itself. Might Ignite, Dr. Webb's attorney, leaned over and whispered something urgent in his client's ear. But Webb didn't respond. He had gone completely gray, his skin taking on an ashen pallor that made him look like he was about to faint or vomit. His hands, which had been clenched in his lap, began to tremble visibly, and I could see sweat stains spreading across the back of his shirt. Despite the courtroom's cool temperature, Judge Hendricks stood abruptly, her chair rolling backward with enough force to hit the wall behind her bench. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded immediate attention, "I am calling a recess. Everyone please remain calm and follow the instructions of the court officers." But even as she spoke these measured words, her eyes were wide with something that looked very much like fear. The bailiff was now speaking rapidly into his radio. all pretense of discretion abandoned. I could make out fragments of his conversation, confirmed threat, immediate evacuation, and most chillingly, multiple devices. The words hit my consciousness like physical blows, each one rearranging my understanding of what was happening around me. This wasn't a recess. This was an emergency. Ada Chen was on her feet now, moving toward the prosecution table with quick, efficient movements as she gathered her files. But instead of heading toward the exit like everyone else, she was moving toward me. "Ms. Davidson," she called out, her voice carrying an urgency that made every nerve in my body fire at once. "We need to move. Now." The fluorescent lights above us flickered once, then twice, creating a strobe effect that made everything in the courtroom appear to move in slow motion. In that stuttering light, I could see James pushing back from the table, his face a mask of professional calm that didn't quite hide the terror in his eyes. The court reporter was abandoning her machine, leaving it running as she headed for the doors with quick, nervous steps that echoed loudly in the suddenly quiet room. Dr. Webb finally moved, turning in his chair to look directly at me for the first time since the trial began. His eyes held an expression I had never seen before. Not remorse, not anger, but something far more disturbing. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen, who had perhaps even helped plan it. The realization hit me. Like a physical blow, he had been waiting for this moment all morning. They all had the sound that came next was unlike anything I had ever heard. A low, rumbling vibration that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within the building itself. It started as barely perceptible tremor, the kind of sound you feel in your bones rather than hear with your ears. But it grew rapidly, building in intensity until the very floor beneath my feet began to vibrate in sympathy. James lunged toward me, his mouth opening to shout something I would never hear. Ada Chen threw herself backward, away from the windows that were beginning to rattle in their frames. The bailiff was speaking frantically into his radio, using words like abort and too late that filled me with a cold terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. In that final moment before everything changed forever, time seemed to slow to an impossible crawl. I could see individual dust motes floating in the fluorescent light, could count the lines of panic etched across Judge Hendrick's face, could feel my own heart beating so hard it seemed like it might burst from my chest. The low rumbling had become a roar now, a sound so deep and powerful that it seemed to be coming from the earth itself. Dr. Webb's lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the growing cacophony, but I could read them clearly. "I'm sorry." Whether he was apologizing to me, to the court, or to whatever higher power he thought might forgive what he had done, I would never know, because in the next instant, the world exploded into light and sound and chaos. And everything I thought I knew about justice and truth and the ordered progression of legal proceedings was obliterated in a maelstrom of destruction that would change everything forever. The last thing I saw before the explosion consumed everything was James reaching for me, his face a mask of desperate determination as he tried to shield me from what was coming. The last thing I heard was my own voice, screaming words that were lost in the roar of destruction that was about to reshape not just the courtroom, but the entire trajectory of my life. The world came back to me in fragments. First sound, a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from inside my own skull. Then the acrid taste of dust and smoke coating my tongue like chalk. My ears felt stuffed with cotton, muffled and strange, as if I were underwater trying to surface toward distant voices. When I tried to open my eyes, grit scraped against my corneas, forcing them shut again as tears streamed down my cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the layer of debris that coated my face. Something heavy was pressing against my legs, pinning me to what I slowly realized was no longer a floor, but a pile of broken concrete and twisted metal. The elegant wooden benches of the courtroom had been reduced to splinters, some of them embedded in the walls, like oversized arrows. Where Judge Hendrick's imposing bench had stood, there was now only a crater filled with chunks of marble and the twisted remains of her chair, its leather upholstery still smoldering. I tried to move and immediately regretted it as pain shot through my entire body like electricity. My left shoulder felt wrong, dislocated or broken, and when I looked down at my carefully chosen navy suit, I saw it was torn and stained with blood. Whether mine or someone else's, I couldn't tell. The metallic taste in my mouth suggested I had bitten my tongue during the blast, and when I touched my face with my right hand, my fingers came away wet and red. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making each breath a struggle that sent me into fits of coughing that felt like they might tear my lungs apart. Through the haze, I could make out shapes that might have been furniture or might have been people. It was impossible to tell in the dim light filtering through what remained of the windows. The fluorescent fixtures had been destroyed, leaving us in a twilight world lit only by the gray morning light and the occasional spark from severed electrical wires. Slowly, painfully, I managed to work my legs free from whatever had been pinning them down. A piece of the ceiling, I realized, a chunk of plaster and wood that had missed crushing me completely by mere inches. As I struggled to sit up, the world spun violently around me, and I had to close my eyes and breathe deeply to keep from vomiting. The smell of cordite and burning insulation filled my nostrils, mixed with something else. The iron smell of blood. "Help!" I tried to call out, but my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Lost in the settling debris and the distant sound of sirens that were finally beginning to wail outside. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder this time. "Is anyone else alive?" The words echoed strangely in the destroyed space, bouncing off the remaining walls in a way that made the courtroom sound cavernous and empty. A groan came from somewhere to my left, and I turned my head carefully, afraid of what I might see. James was lying partially buried under what had been the court reporter's desk, his silver hair now gray with dust and debris. Blood was seeping from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were open and he was trying to speak. I couldn't make out his words, but the fact that he was conscious filled me with a relief so profound it brought fresh tears to my eyes. The prosecution table had been completely destroyed, papers scattered like confetti throughout the wreckage, but I could see Ada Chen's distinctive navy blazer among the debris near where the windows had been. She wasn't moving, and the unnatural angle of her limbs filled me with a sick dread. The defense table had fared no better. Harold Morrison was nowhere to be seen, though his briefcase lay split open, its contents mixing with the rubble in a grotesque parody of legal organization. As my vision cleared and adjusted to the dim light, I began to make out more details of the devastation around me. The walls that were still standing were scarred with deep gouges and blackened with soot. Chunks of the ceiling hung at dangerous angles, held up by nothing more than damaged support beams that creaked ominously with every small movement. The floor was a treacherous landscape of broken glass, twisted metal, and debris that could hide any number of hazards. I tried to stand, using a piece of broken bench for support, but my legs were shaky and unreliable. The world tilted alarmingly, and I had to grip the makeshift support with both hands to keep from falling. Blood was running down my arms from cuts I couldn't even feel yet, the adrenaline in my system masking what I was sure would soon become excruciating pain. But I was alive, conscious, and mobile, which was more than I could say for many others in the room. "James," I called out, my voice stronger now, despite the dust coating my throat. "James, can you hear me?" He turned his head slightly in my direction, his eyes struggling to focus, but he managed to lift one hand in what might have been a wave or might have been a plea for help. Blood was pooling beneath his head, and I knew I needed to get to him. Needed to assess his injuries and try to help him if I could. The bailiff was slumped against what remained of his desk, his radio still attached to his belt, but silent now, probably damaged in the blast. His uniform was torn and bloodied, but I could see his chest rising and falling in the irregular pattern of someone struggling to breathe. The two federal agents who had entered just before the explosion were nowhere to be seen, though I thought I glimpsed a dark suit jacket among the rubble near where the doors had been, as I picked my way carefully through the debris toward James. Stepping over chunks of concrete and twisted metal, the full magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. This hadn't been an accident. Someone had deliberately destroyed this courtroom, had planned and executed an attack that was meant to kill everyone inside. The realization that I had survived what was clearly intended to be mass murder filled me with a strange mixture of gratitude and survivor's guilt that threatened to overwhelm me. The sound of sirens was getting closer now, and I could hear voices shouting commands outside the building. Help was coming, but I didn't know how long it would take them to reach us, or how many of us would still be alive when they did. All I knew was that I had survived the first few minutes after the explosion, and now I had to do whatever I could to make sure that James and anyone else who might still be breathing in this devastated courtroom survived long enough to see rescue arrive. But first, I had to find out what had happened to Dr. Webb, and more importantly, I had to find Judge Hendricks, because somewhere in this wreckage, buried beneath tons of debris and twisted metal, were the answers to questions I hadn't even known I should be asking, questions about who had done this, and why, and whether the trial that had brought us all here had been the real target, or just an excuse to bring us all together in one place at one time. Through the settling dust and debris, I caught a glimpse of movement near what had been the courtroom's main entrance. The heavy wooden doors had been blown completely off their hinges, leaving gaping holes in the wall that offered a view of the devastated hallway beyond. But it wasn't the destruction that made my blood run cold. It was the figure picking his way carefully through the rubble, moving with a purpose that seemed completely at odds with the chaos surrounding us. James Morrison, my lawyer, the man I had trusted to guide me through this legal nightmare, was making his way toward the exit with deliberate, measured steps. His expensive suit was torn and dusty, and blood was trickling from a cut above his left eye. But he was upright and mobile in a way that suggested his injuries were far less severe than they appeared. What shocked me wasn't his condition, but his behavior. He wasn't calling out for other survivors, wasn't checking on the wounded, wasn't doing any of the things a normal person would do in the aftermath of such devastation. James. He froze at the sound of my voice, his shoulders tensing in a way that reminded me of an animal caught in headlights. For a moment I thought he would turn around, would come back to help me and the other survivors scattered throughout the wreckage. Instead, he glanced back over his shoulder, and the expression on his face made my stomach drop like a stone. There was no relief in his eyes at seeing that I had survived. No concern for my obvious injuries, no rush to offer assistance to his client who was bleeding and trapped in a destroyed courtroom. Instead, there was something that looked disturbingly like disappointment, mixed with a cold calculation that I had never seen in him before. It was the look of someone whose carefully laid plans had gone awry, someone who was reassessing and adapting to an unwelcome development. James, please. I tried again, struggling to my feet using a broken piece of the judge's bench for support. I need help. There are people hurt in here. My words echoed strangely in the damaged space, but they seemed to galvanize him into action. Not toward me, but away. He turned his back on my pleas and continued picking his way through the debris toward the exit, moving faster now, almost frantically. The realization hit me like another explosion. This one internal and just as devastating as the one that had destroyed the courtroom. James wasn't fleeing in panic or confusion, he was escaping. He knew something about what had happened here, had perhaps even known it was going to happen. The strange tension I had noticed in him all morning, the way he had positioned himself in the courtroom, his whispered warning to get down, it all suddenly made horrifying sense. "Don't leave me here," I screamed, my voice breaking with desperation and betrayal. The man who had spent months preparing me for this trial, who had held my hand through depositions and coached me through my testimony, who had promised to see me through to justice, that man was abandoning me in a pile of rubble. Without a backward glance, the betrayal was almost worse than the physical pain radiating through my battered body. James paused at the threshold of the destroyed doorway, and for one hopeful moment I thought he might reconsider, might remember his duty to his client and to basic human decency. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone, checking it quickly before putting it away. The gesture was so casual, so at odds with the emergency surrounding us, that it confirmed my worst suspicions about his involvement in whatever had happened here. "You knew," I whispered, though he was too far away to hear me now. "You knew this was going to happen." The words felt like poison in my mouth, bitter with the taste of betrayal and disbelief. How long had he been planning this? Had our entire professional relationship been a lie? A setup designed to get me into this courtroom? At this exact moment, the questions multiplied in my mind like cancer cells, each one more horrifying than the last. He disappeared through the doorway without looking back, leaving me alone with the wounded and the dead in a courtroom that had been transformed into a war zone. I could hear his footsteps echoing down the hallway, moving away from us with increasing speed as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder outside the building. He was fleeing the scene like the criminal he apparently was, leaving his client bleeding and terrified among the ruins of what should have been my day of justice. The abandonment hit me harder than any physical injury I had sustained in the blast. James had been my anchor in the legal system, my guide through the complex maze of criminal proceedings that I had never navigated before. I had trusted him with my story, my fears, my hopes for justice. I had believed in his competence, his integrity, his commitment to seeing this case through to a righteous conclusion, and now I was learning that it had all been an elaborate deception. As his footsteps faded into the distance, replaced by the growing chorus of sirens and emergency responders outside, I felt a rage building inside me that was almost as powerful as the explosion that had destroyed the courtroom. This wasn't just about surviving a terrorist attack anymore. This was about betrayal at the deepest level, about trust shattered so completely that I wondered if I would ever be able to believe in anyone again. But even as the fury built inside me, threatening to overwhelm my ability to think clearly, I knew that dwelling on James's betrayal was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. There were wounded people in this courtroom, people who needed help. That wasn't coming from the man who should have been coordinating our rescue. If I was going to survive this nightmare, if any of us were, I would have to do it without his help. The sound of voices was getting closer. Now, emergency responders working their way through the building, calling out for survivors and coordinating rescue efforts. Help was coming, but I didn't know how long it would take them to reach us, or whether James's flight had somehow compromised our chances of being found quickly. All I knew was that I was on my own now, abandoned by the one person I had counted on to see me through this ordeal. as I turned away from the empty doorway and began making my way through the debris toward Judge Hendricks, who I could see lying motionless near the remains of her bench. I made a promise to myself. If I survived this day, if I lived to see James Morrison again, I would make sure he answered for what he had done. Not just for abandoning me in my moment of greatest need, but for whatever role he had played in bringing us all to this point of devastation and death. Judge Hendricks lay crumpled beneath a massive piece of the courtroom's ornate ceiling, her black robes spread around her like dark wings against the gray concrete dust. A pool of blood was slowly expanding from beneath her head, seeping into the cracks in the fractured marble floor with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Her reading glasses hung from their chain around her neck, one lens completely shattered, the other reflecting the dim light filtering through the destroyed windows like a broken mirror. I approached her carefully, my feet sliding on the treacherous mixture of pulverized concrete and broken glass that now covered what had once been the polished floor of her courtroom. Each step sent sharp pains shooting up through my injured legs, and I had to use pieces of debris for support as I made my way across the devastation. The metallic taste of blood in my mouth was getting stronger, and I could feel warm wetness running down my arms from cuts. I still couldn't feel through the numbing shock of survival. When I reached her, I dropped to my knees beside her still form, immediately feeling the dampness of her blood soaking through the torn fabric of my skirt. Her eyes were closed, her face pale beneath a coating of dust and debris, but I could see the slight rise and fall of her chest. That meant she was still alive. A large gash across her forehead was bleeding steadily, and her left arm was bent at an angle that suggested it was badly broken, but she was breathing. And that was more than I could say for many others in the destroyed courtroom. Judge Hendricks, I whispered, my voice hoarse and barely audible even to myself. Your Honor, can you hear me? I reached out with a trembling hand to touch her shoulder, afraid of causing more damage, but desperate to know if she was conscious, if she could respond to my voice. Her eyelids fluttered at my touch, and I felt a surge of hope so powerful it made me dizzy. Her eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus in the dim light. When her gaze finally found mine, there was a moment of confusion, as if she couldn't quite remember where she was or what had happened. Then reality crashed back into her consciousness, and I watched her face transform from bewilderment to horror as she took in the destruction surrounding us. My God, she breathed, her voice barely more than a whisper, but carrying all the authority that had commanded respect in this courtroom for over 2 decades. What happened? What? She tried to sit up, then immediately fell back with a groan of pain as her injuries made themselves known. Her eyes found mine again, and I saw them sharpen with the kind of focus that had made her reputation as a judge who missed nothing. There was an explosion, I managed to say, though the words felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of what had occurred. The courtroom. Everything. I gestured helplessly at the devastation around us, unable to find words that could encompass the complete destruction of the ordered world we had both known just minutes ago. Judge Hendricks' gaze moved slowly around the ruined courtroom, taking in details with the same methodical attention she had once given to legal briefs and witness testimony. I could see her cataloging the damage, assessing the situation with the kind of analytical mind that had served her well on the bench. When her eyes returned to mine, they held a clarity that was both reassuring and terrifying. How many others? She asked, her voice gaining strength despite her obvious pain. How many survivors? The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I didn't know. In my shock and confusion, in my focus on reaching her, I hadn't done a systematic search for other survivors. I had seen James moving, had heard groans from what I thought might be other people, but I hadn't actually confirmed how many of us were still alive in this hellscape. I don't know, I admitted, shame flooding through me at my failure to assess the situation more completely. I saw my lawyer heading for the exit, but he didn't stop to help. There might be others. I gestured toward the areas of the courtroom I hadn't been able to explore yet. Afraid of what we might find when we did, Judge Hendricks tried again to sit up, gritting her teeth against the pain but managing to prop herself against a piece of fallen ceiling beam. Blood was still seeping from her head wound, and I could see that her left arm was useless, but her eyes held the same steely determination that had intimidated countless attorneys over the years. Even broken and bleeding in the ruins of her courtroom, she radiated authority. Help me up, she commanded, and despite everything that had happened, despite the chaos and destruction around us, I found myself responding to that voice of absolute authority. I carefully helped her into a more upright position, supporting her weight as she fought through waves of pain and dizziness that I could see washing over her face in visible waves. Ms. Davidson, she said, her voice growing stronger as she fought through her injuries, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This wasn't an accident. Someone planned this, orchestrated it specifically to target this trial, these proceedings. Her words confirmed the terrible suspicions that had been growing in my mind since I saw James fleeing through the debris. The weight of her statement settled over me like a lead blanket. This had been deliberate, calculated murder disguised as terrorism. Someone had wanted us dead, all of us who had been in this courtroom seeking justice, seeking truth, seeking some kind of resolution to the nightmare that had brought us here. The realization made the blood running down my arms feel cold, despite its warmth. But who? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. The timing had been too perfect. The preparation too thorough, the knowledge to complete. This had been orchestrated by someone who knew exactly when we would all be here, exactly how to maximize the damage, exactly how to ensure that justice would never be served. Judge Hendricks met my eyes with a look that held decades of experience dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. Someone who had everything to lose if this trial continued. She said quietly, someone who knew that the truth coming out would destroy them completely. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that I was only beginning to understand. As we sat there in the wreckage of her courtroom, two women who had survived an attempt on our lives, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. The explosion had been just the beginning. Now we had to figure out who had tried to kill us, why they had failed, and most importantly, how we were going to survive long enough to make sure they were brought to justice for what they had done. Judge Hendricks gripped my arm with her uninjured hand, her fingers digging into my flesh with surprising strength for someone who had just survived a massive explosion. Blood was still trickling down her face from the gash on her forehead, but her eyes burned with an intensity that reminded me why she had commanded such respect in the legal community. Ms. Davidson, she said, her voice gaining clarity despite her injuries, I need you to tell me everything, right now, before anyone else arrives. This may be our only chance to get the truth on record. The absurdity of the situation struck me like another physical blow. Here we were, bleeding and broken in the ruins of what had been her courtroom, and she was still trying to conduct proceedings, still seeking to establish facts and preserve testimony. But even as the rational part of my mind recoiled at the impossibility of it all, I found myself responding to her authority, to the desperate need in her voice that suggested she understood something I was only beginning to grasp. Dr. Webb knew, I began, my voice shaking as the words tumbled out of me. I could see it in his face during the proceedings. He wasn't surprised when the tension started building, when everyone began acting strangely. He was waiting for something to happen. The admission felt like tearing open a wound, but I forced myself to continue, to give her everything I had observed in those final, terrifying minutes before the explosion. Judge Hendricks nodded grimly, blood from her head wound dripping onto her torn robes as she listened. I suspected as much. The way he responded to certain procedural questions during jury selection, the way his attorney kept checking his watch. It all suggested they knew this trial wasn't going to reach its natural conclusion. Her words confirmed what I had been afraid to fully acknowledge. This hadn't been random terrorism, but a carefully orchestrated attempt to silence everyone who might testify about Dr. Webb's crimes. And my lawyer? I continued. The betrayal. Still raw and burning in my throat. James Morrison. He warned me to get down just before it happened. He knew, Your Honor, he was part of this. The words felt like poison leaving my mouth, each syllable heavy with the weight of trust shattered beyond repair. To say it aloud, to make it official in front of the one person whose authority still mattered in this destroyed place, felt like the final nail in the coffin of my faith in the justice system. Morrison's involvement explains how they knew the exact timing, the precise moment when everyone would be in the courtroom. Judge Hendricks said, her legal mind still functioning despite her physical trauma. He had access to all the scheduling. Information knew exactly when witnesses would be present, when the maximum number of people would be in one place. She paused, coughing up blood that she spat onto the rubble beside her, before continuing with renewed determination. Tell me about the children, she commanded, her voice taking on the same tone she had used when questioning witnesses from her bench. Tell me what Dr. Webb did to them, what you witnessed. What drove someone to such desperate measures to prevent this testimony from being heard? The request felt surreal in our current circumstances, but I understood the urgency behind it. If we didn't survive, if no official record existed of what had happened, the children's suffering would be meaningless. Through tears that mixed with the blood and dust on my face, I told her everything. Every instance of abuse I had witnessed or suspected. Every time I had seen a child emerge from Dr. Webb's office looking traumatized and violated. Every piece of evidence I had collected that proved his systematic exploitation of the vulnerable children in his care. My voice grew stronger as I spoke, as if giving testimony in this ruined courtroom was somehow purifying, somehow transforming my survival into something meaningful. Judge Hendricks listened with the same focused attention she had given to countless trials over her career, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details, building a complete picture of the crimes that had ultimately led us all to this moment of destruction. "This testimony is heard and noted," she said formally when I finished, as if her words could somehow preserve what I had told her, could ensure that my witness would survive even if we didn't. As the sound of rescue workers grew closer, their voices echoing through the damaged building as they searched for survivors, Judge Hendricks met my eyes one final time. "Whatever happens next," she said, "whatever they claim about this explosion, about who was responsible and why it happened, remember that justice was served here today, in this destroyed courtroom with our blood mixed together in the rubble. The truth was finally spoken and officially heard. That's something no explosion can ever destroy." The sound of my own blood dripping onto the broken marble beneath me had become a steady metronome, marking time in the destroyed courtroom. Each drop seemed to echo in the strange acoustics created by the damaged walls and missing ceiling. A liquid percussion that reminded me with every beat that I was still alive, still conscious, still fighting against the shock and blood loss that threatened to pull me into unconsciousness. Judge Hendricks was growing paler by the minute, her breathing becoming more labored as we both struggled against injuries that were far more serious than either of us wanted to acknowledge. I tore strips from my ruined blazer with trembling fingers, the fabric ripping with sharp sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the tomb-like quiet of the ruined courtroom. Working as carefully as I could with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I pressed the makeshift bandages against the worst of Judge Hendricks' head wounds, trying to stem the flow of blood that was slowly but steadily draining her strength. She winced at my touch but didn't pull away, understanding as I did that we had to help each other if we had any hope of surviving long enough for rescue to arrive. "Your arm?" she gasped, nodding toward my left shoulder where blood was seeping through my torn shirt in an expanding stain. That suggested the damage was worse than I had realized. When I looked down, I could see bone through the torn flesh, a glimpse of white that made my stomach lurch and my vision blur at the edges. The adrenaline that had been masking my pain was wearing off, replaced by waves of agony that made it difficult to think clearly or move with any kind of coordination. Using more fabric torn from our destroyed clothing, we worked together to create pressure bandages for my wounds, Judge Hendricks directing the process with the same calm authority she had once used to manage her courtroom. Her legal training had apparently included emergency first aid, and she guided my fumbling attempt. Judge Hendricks stirred at the sound of approaching rescue, her eyes fluttering open to focus on my face with an effort that was clearly costing her dearly. "The phone," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the noise of the rescue operation. "Webb's phone. Make sure they preserve it as evidence. Don't let them claim this was random terrorism." Even in her weakened state, her legal mind was still functioning, still focused on ensuring that justice would ultimately prevail. Despite the attempt to silence us all when the first paramedic finally reached us through the gap they had carved in the debris, he was a young man with kind eyes who took one look at our condition and immediately called for additional medical support. "We've got 2 critical survivors here. I need a trauma team and extraction equipment now." His hands moved efficiently as he assessed our injuries, starting 4 lines and applying proper medical dressings to replace our makeshift bandages. As they worked to stabilize us for transport, I could hear radio chatter from the various rescue teams working throughout the building. The casualty reports were devastating, at least 12 confirmed dead, including several court personnel, family members who had been in the spectator section, and what sounded like multiple law enforcement officers. The magnitude of the destruction, the sheer number of lives lost in this calculated act of murder, hit me like another physical blow. "The defendant?" I managed to gasp to one of the paramedics as they prepared to move me onto a stretcher. "Dr. Marcus Webb. Did you find him? Is he among the casualties?" The paramedic exchanged a look with his partner that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "No male matching that description has been found among the victims," he said carefully, "but the search is still ongoing. Some areas of the building are still too unstable to access safely." His diplomatic phrasing couldn't hide the truth. Webb was gone, vanished in the chaos, probably evacuated along with my traitorous lawyer before the explosion ever occurred. The journey to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical interventions for drips and oxygen masks and the constant monitoring of vital signs that spoke to the severity of my injuries. Through the ambulance windows, I caught glimpses of the courthouse exterior, its stately facade now pockmarked with blast damage and surrounded by emergency vehicles, whose flashing lights painted the afternoon sky in urgent reds and blues. At the trauma center, they wheeled me directly into surgery, but not before I was able to grab the arm of Detective Rodriguez, who had somehow survived the explosion and was coordinating with federal investigators already on scene. Webb's phone, I whispered urgently as they prepared to anesthetize me in his briefcase. Text messages about timing, he knew. Rodriguez nodded grimly and made a note in his tablet confirming that the evidence would be secured and analyzed. When I finally awakened hours later in the intensive care unit, my left arm was immobilized in a complex apparatus of pins and screws, my torso wrapped in bandages that covered surgical repairs to internal injuries I hadn't even realized I had sustained. Judge Hendricks was in the bed next to mine, still unconscious but stable, according to the nurse who briefed me on both our conditions. The FBI agent who interviewed me that first evening was a woman named Sarah Martinez who listened with grim attention as I recounted everything I could remember about the events leading up to the explosion. When I described James Morrison's behavior and his flight from the scene, her expression darkened with a fury that matched my own. "We have an APB out on Morrison," she assured me. "Airport security, border crossings, all his known associates. He won't get far." But even as she spoke with professional confidence, I could see the doubt in her eyes about whether justice would ultimately be served for the man who had betrayed, not just me, but every principal the legal system was supposed to represent. 6 months later, I sat in a different courtroom in a different city. My left arm still bearing the scars from that terrible day, but functioning well enough to allow me to grip the witness stand as I gave my final testimony. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia was everything the destroyed local courthouse had been imposing. Formal, designed to convey the weight and dignity of justice, but I approached it now with a wariness born of experience, an understanding that the system I had once trusted implicitly was as fragile and corruptible as the people who operated within it. The recovery had been long and painful, measured not just in the healing of broken bones and torn flesh, but in the slow reconstruction of my faith in the possibility of justice. Judge Hendricks had spent 2 months in the hospital, her injuries far more severe than mine, but she had survived with her sharp intellect intact and her commitment to seeing this case through to its conclusion, stronger than ever. She had become more than a fellow survivor. She had become my anchor in the storm of media attention and legal proceedings that followed our emergence from the rubble. James Morrison had been captured 3 weeks after the explosion, trying to board a private flight to a non-extradition country with a false passport and enough cash to suggest he had been planning his escape for months. His arrest had been front-page news, the photograph of him in handcuffs, serving as a stark reminder that even those sworn to uphold justice could be corrupted by money and fear. During his interrogation, he had revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Dr. Webb's increasingly desperate attempts to avoid trial, the involvement of several prominent families whose children had been victims, and the decision to silence everyone rather than risk exposure. Dr. Marcus Webb himself had been found 2 days after Morrison's arrest, living under an assumed name in a cabin in rural Montana. Unlike his co-conspirator, he had not gone quietly, requiring a tactical team to subdue him when he barricaded himself inside and threatened to detonate another explosive device. His capture had been a relief so profound that I had wept for hours upon hearing the news, finally allowing myself to believe that the nightmare might actually have an ending. The trial itself had been a media circus, with reporters from national news outlets covering every day of proceedings and protesters gathering outside the courthouse to demand justice for the children who had been victimized twice, first by Webb's abuse, and then by his attempt to murder anyone who might testify about it. I had testified for 3 full days, describing not just the abuse I had witnessed, but the explosion itself, the aftermath, the betrayal by my own lawyer, and the determination that had kept me fighting for justice even when it seemed impossible. Today was the sentencing hearing, the final chapter in a story that had begun with my naive faith in the system and evolved through fire and blood into something harder but perhaps more honest. Webb sat at the defendant's table in shackles, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a broken man who had gambled everything on silencing his victims and lost. His attorney, a court-appointed public defender since no reputable firm, would take his case after Morrison's revelations had argued for leniency based on mental illness and childhood trauma. But the evidence of premeditated mass murder was too overwhelming to ignore. Judge Patricia Crawford, who had been specially assigned to this case because of her expertise in terrorism prosecutions, read the verdict with the same gravitas that Judge Hendricks might have brought to bear. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional consecutive sentences for the terrorism charges, the child abuse convictions, and the conspiracy counts. Webb showed no emotion as the words were spoken, staring straight ahead with the blank expression of someone who had already accepted his fate. But it was Morrison's sentencing, held the following week, that provided the closure I hadn't realized I needed. As I watched my former lawyer, the man who had prepared me for testimony he knew I would never be allowed to give, who had held my hand, while planning my murder, receive his own life sentence. I felt something shift inside me. The rage that had sustained me through months of recovery and legal proceedings began to transform into something else. Something that felt almost like peace. The civil suits that followed netted substantial settlements for the families of the victims, money that could never restore the lives that had been lost, but could at least ensure that the children who survived would have access to the therapy and support they needed. I used my portion to establish a foundation focused on protecting whistleblowers in institutional abuse cases, creating the kind of support system I wished had existed when I first discovered what Webb was doing to his patients. As I walked down the courthouse steps for the final time, Judge Hendricks beside me, moving slowly but steadily with the aid of a walking stick, I realized that survival had taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. Justice wasn't something that happened to you or for you. It was something you fought for, something you created through your willingness to speak truth, even when that truth might cost you everything. The explosion had been meant to silence us, to bury the evidence of Webb's crimes beneath tons of rubble and twisted metal. Instead, it had amplified our voices, turning a local criminal case into a national conversation about institutional abuse, legal ethics, and the lengths to which powerful people would go to protect their secrets. The children who had been Webb's victims finally had their day in court, their suffering acknowledged and their abuser held accountable. And I had learned that sometimes the most important testimony you can give is the one you deliver while bleeding. To a judge who listens from beneath the rubble of everything you both thought you could count on,